I'm Evelyn Carter, and for the past 2 years, I have been living in my daughter's house in Orange County, California. People assume that when a parent moves in with their grown child, it is out of need or weakness. For me, it was loneliness. After my husband died, the big old house we built together became too quiet, so when Megan said I could stay with her and her husband, I thought maybe it would feel like family again. That was the story I told myself, anyway. It was one of those warm California Saturdays when the air smelled faintly of cut grass and ocean salt drifting inland. Sunlight poured over the back patio, and voices floated in from every direction like music, from a radio left on too long. Megan had gathered her friends from work and the neighborhood. They stood in clusters with wine glasses, laughing at stories I could not hear. I stayed in the kitchen, where the cool tile and the hum of the refrigerator gave me somewhere to disappear. I had baked shortbread cookies from an old recipe my mother taught me when I was a girl. Butter and sugar were creamed by hand until they turned pale and soft. I arranged them neatly on a tray, wiped my hands on my apron, and took a deep breath before stepping out. It was still my instinct to offer food, to be part of the room. I told myself it was just being polite. But the moment I crossed the sliding door onto the patio, the noise shifted. Megan stood at the center of her guests, gesturing with a cocktail in her hand, her hair catching the sunlight. She looked beautiful and sharp, the kind of woman who owned a room. I walked toward them, holding the tray like a shield. "Cookies, everyone," I said softly, my voice nearly lost under their laughter. A few people took one, smiling quickly the way you smile at a stranger on the street. Megan glanced at me and gave a small laugh, waving her hand toward me like she was introducing a piece of furniture. "She just kind of stays here." The words were light, but they landed like stones. The group chuckled awkwardly and looked away. Nobody corrected her. Nobody told her to stop. Eric, her husband, met my eyes for a second, then looked down at his drink. I felt my hands tremble against the tray, but forced myself to smile. I turned back into the house before anyone noticed. The kitchen smelled of sugar and heat, but it felt empty. I set the tray on the counter and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the muffled laughter outside. This was supposed to be my family now. Instead, I felt like an invisible guest in a place where I washed the dishes and stayed out of the way. I told myself to breathe, to stay quiet, because that is what mothers do. But in that moment, the quiet felt heavier than the tray in my hands. When I first moved into Megan's house, I truly believed we were turning a new page. She had just renovated the guest suite and told me it would be mine, fully furnished with a soft bed, a reading chair by the window, and room for my books. I remember sitting on that bed the first night, thinking maybe this was the kind of togetherness people talked about when they said families should stick together. I didn't expect it to be perfect. I just thought it would feel like home. At first, it did. Megan brought me chamomile tea in the evenings and even asked for my help planning meals. Eric was polite, always offering to carry groceries or set the table. For a little while, it felt like I belonged. But over time, the little things began to vanish. My knitting basket disappeared from the living room. My antique clock was replaced by a sleek, silent one, Megan said, that better matched the decor. My gardening gloves were moved from the patio to a storage box in the garage. She started creating rules. No boiling garlic because the smell lingered. I don't watch old TV shows unless I use headphones. No guests unless cleared ahead of time. I tried to smile through it. Told myself it was her house now, and I was just adjusting. But every new rule made my world feel smaller, as if my presence needed to be reduced to the edges. The kitchen had once been where I felt most at peace. Now, even that space carried tension. She reorganized the pantry without asking, moved my tea tins to the top shelf, and labeled shelves like she ran a company, not a home. One morning, I found my small collection of herb pots missing from the patio. When I asked about them, Megan said they cluttered the aesthetic and made the space feel busy. I nodded and said nothing. I always said nothing. The air in the house started to change. Conversations happened without me. Weekend plans excluded me, and dinner invitations dwindled. I was still cooking, cleaning, and folding laundry, But somewhere along the way, I became invisible. One night, I came downstairs for a glass of warm milk. I froze at the edge of the hallway when I heard Megan's voice from the living room. She didn't know I was there. She said she was tired of feeling like there was someone always there, always in the background. Eric murmured something I couldn't hear. Then Megan's voice sharpened. She's just emotional clutter. That was the phrase. I stood in the shadows, holding that empty glass, my hands suddenly cold. I don't remember walking back to my room, but I remember sitting on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the wall as if something inside me had cracked clean through. Emotional clutter. That's what I had become in my daughter's eyes. Not a mother. Not someone who raised her, stayed up with her during childhood fevers, stitched her prom dress when she couldn't afford a new one. I was now cluttered. Something to manage, to push aside, to minimize. That night I didn't sleep. I lay still in the dark, listening to the sound of my own breath, and wondering how love turns into this quiet kind of cruelty. I didn't cry, I didn't speak. I just started taking notes. It was a Friday night, and Megan had invited 2 of Eric's business friends over for dinner. The kind of men who wore expensive watches and laughed too loudly at their own jokes. I had spent the whole afternoon preparing a meal from scratch. Roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary, mashed potatoes with butter and cream, green beans sautéed just the way Eric liked. The house smelled like memory. Warm, familiar, almost like it used to feel when Paul was still alive. And we hosted neighbors in the old dining room, with mismatched chairs and candlelight. The table was set perfectly. I made sure of it. I smoothed the tablecloth 3 times and polished the silverware until it gleamed. As we sat down to eat, one of the men took a bite and said something about the chicken being amazing. Megan laughed, tossed her hair a little, and without even glancing my way, she said, "Oh God. No. That's our resident freeloader's work." The room went still for a second, just long enough for everyone to realize something awful had been said. Then came the laughter, nervous and shallow, like the air had suddenly turned thinner. I didn't respond. I kept my smile, the way I always had, and excused myself before dessert. I walked back into the kitchen and stood at the sink, watching the faucet drip in slow, deliberate beats. Resident freeloader, that was what I was now. Not Evelyn, not Mom, not the woman who made that same roasted chicken recipe for Megan's birthdays growing up. The words stung, but they also landed on something deeper. A quiet realization I had been avoiding for too long. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and let my mind drift back to the house. Not this one, but our house. Mine and Paul's. The old 2-story, with the creaky floors and peeling shutters. It was the spring of 1986 when we first moved in. The yard was wild with weeds, the roof leaked, and the wallpaper peeled in every room. But to us, it was everything. Paul used to run his hand along the banister and say, "It's got good bones, just like us." We poured ourselves into that home, painted walls together, patched up floors, planted a garden that never quite grew right but still made us proud. Megan was just a little girl then, always underfoot with paint on her cheeks and jelly on her fingers. That house watched us become a family. It held our laughter and our fights, the sleepless nights, the small triumphs, and the grief when Paul got sick and faded too fast. Even after he passed, I couldn't leave. I stayed for 5 more years. Every corner whispered his name. I still remember how the front door stuck in the winter, and how the kitchen tiles warmed up by noon. That place wasn't just a structure. It was a history. And through all those years, even after moving in with Megan, I never let it go. The deed, the title, the property tax bills, all still had my name. They thought I had nowhere else to go. But that house still belonged to me. It always had. I had been silent for so long that even I forgot what power looked like. But that night, standing in a kitchen I no longer recognized, with a name that no longer meant anything in this house. I remembered. I wasn't a freeloader. I was a builder, a mother, and still, a homeowner. It started with a folder. Megan walked into my room one afternoon, her heels clicking like punctuation against the hardwood. She sat across from me with the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Mom," she said, "I need a small favor. Just a signature." She laid the papers down and started talking about refinancing, equity, and how it would help with taxes. "Nothing changes," she added. "You'd still live here." I didn't touch the pen. I folded another towel slowly and asked what this had to do with the house. She said it was just paperwork, nothing big. I told her no. She blinked like she didn't hear me right, then stood and left the room without another word. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, the bank called. There was a flag on a mortgage application tied to my property. My name was listed, but something didn't match. I asked them to send the documents. The envelope came the next day. Inside were copies of forms with Megan's name listed as the owner. Signatures forged in shaky versions of my handwriting. She had claimed she inherited the house, that she was now making all financial decisions on my behalf. I sat at the kitchen table with those papers in front of me. My tea had gone cold. My hands didn't shake. I just stared at the false version of my life someone else had tried to write. I didn't scream. I didn't confront her. I got quiet. Then I pulled out the old address book I kept in the drawer with my measuring spoons and called Walter. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed to talk. He didn't ask questions, just said to come by at 10. Walter Brenner had been Paul's best friend since high school. He helped us close on the house the day we bought it. He was there when Paul got sick and stayed long after the funeral ended. If there was anyone I trusted with what came next, it was him. Megan thought she had the final say. She was wrong. That house had one name on the deed. Mine. Walter reviewed everything. The deed, the tax records, the original purchase contract. He said Megan didn't have a legal leg to stand on, and I nodded, already knowing. Then I told him I wanted to sell. Not someday. Now. He looked at me closely and didn't argue. He just said he'd draft protections and told me to find a realtor I trusted. I walked 2 blocks to a small real estate office I remembered from years ago. The door was glass, with lavender lettering that read Whitman & Co. Inside stood a young woman with a soft voice and a firm handshake. Her name was Jessica. She was the daughter of someone I used to work with at the library. I told her I needed the house listed fast. No open houses, no signs, just serious buyers. We met at the property the next morning. I sat in the car while she walked the perimeter, taking photos and notes. I didn't want to go inside. Not anymore. Jessica came back with a clipboard and said the market was hot. She handed me a pen and said it was time to authorize the listing. My hand didn't tremble when I signed. I had waited too long to waver now. Within hours, there were offers. 3 serious ones. A tech entrepreneur looking for a weekend escape, a pair of sisters who wanted to flip the house, and a divorced woman in her 50s named Diane. Jessica said Diane had just settled her finances and was looking for somewhere to begin again. Her voice, Jessica added, reminded her of someone who had been quiet too long. I chose Diane. Not for the price, though hers was strong, but because of the way she asked questions, the way she paused before speaking, the way her tone carried weariness and resolve in equal measure. Jessica called it intuition. I called it knowing. I signed the contract that evening from a motel room, the same room where I had slept the night before, after leaving Megan's house in silence. When I clicked the final signature, I didn't smile. I just exhaled. It was done. The house wasn't mine anymore, but it wasn't hers either. And that was enough. It was just after 3 in the morning when I quietly got out of bed. The house was still, the kind of silence that only happens deep in the night when even the walls stop creaking. I didn't turn on the light. I moved by memory. I already knew which floorboards would groan and which steps to skip. I had rehearsed this for weeks, without saying a word. My suitcase was small, soft-sided, with a broken zipper tab I had repaired with a paperclip years ago. I packed what mattered. A few changes of clothes. My leather wallet. The title deed to the house. The marriage certificate that Paul and I signed in 1970. His death certificate. And a photo of us on our wedding day, tucked in a cloth, like it might shatter. I folded a shawl around it, just in case. Before I left, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a note. It was short. Megan, I wrote. I don't hate you, but I'm done asking for space in a house I paid for with my life. I have nothing left to give. I left the note under the porcelain teapot she never used, and slipped out through the back door without a sound. The air outside was crisp and sweet, the kind of early spring air that smells like rain before it falls. I stood in the backyard for a moment. My rosemary bush was still green, my lavender just starting to bloom again. I had planted them by hand, one by one. Years ago, when I still believed that care would be enough. I didn't cry. I just walked. The motel sat off the highway, tucked between a gas station and a diner. It had peeling paint and a humming ice machine by the stairs. No frills, no questions. The kind of place where quiet was part of the price. I paid in cash, took the key, and sat on the edge of the bed. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, but to me, it smelled like freedom. I opened the window just a crack and let the cold air in. The night was still alive outside, with cars passing like whispers. I took out the photo of Paul and held it in my lap. His smile hadn't aged. Mine had. I remembered the way he used to pour my tea, always too hot. Always with too much honey. He would have told me I waited too long to leave. But he would have understood. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Not because the bed was soft, not because I felt safe, but because, for the first time in a long time, I was no longer someone's burden. I was just myself, and that was enough. The envelope was delivered at 8:37 a.m. Megan opened the door in her robe, bleary-eyed, holding her phone like she was waiting for a text that hadn't come. Inside the envelope were two documents. The first was the official record of sale, signed, notarized, and processed. The second was a formal notice to vacate. 7 days. No extensions. The new owner, Diane Westfield, would take legal action if the house wasn't empty by the deadline. My name was on the sender line. Not Mom, just Evelyn Carter. I imagined she read it twice, then 3 more times, looking for some mistake. There wasn't one. I had followed every step, filed everything correctly, left no room for her to wriggle out. What she never understood was that silence doesn't mean ignorance. It means patience, and mine had run out. By that afternoon, the phone started ringing. Megan called once. Then again, 12 times in the span of an hour. No voicemails. Just missed calls, stacking like guilt. I didn't answer. I had nothing left to say. The next morning, Jessica forwarded me a voicemail. Megan had called, pretending to be the rightful owner, demanding that the sale be reversed. Jessica's reply was simple. Everything had been verified and filed. This conversation is over. The neighbors noticed. They always do. The lawn went untrimmed for 3 days. And cars began to slow as they passed. People whispered behind hedges, paused longer at mailboxes, and peeked through blinds. By the 3rd day, the rumors had a rhythm. She's being evicted. Can you believe it? Her own mother sold the house out from under her. Imagine that. Imagine being thrown out of your mother's house. Eric didn't say much, but actions are louder. He started packing quietly. Slept in the guest room. When Megan tried to hand him one of her suitcases, he stepped back. I'm going to my mother's, he said. Then he left, just like that. On the 6th day, just before sunset, Megan came to my apartment building. She stood outside the security gate with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her hair pulled into a messy knot. No makeup, no sunglasses, just exhaustion written all over her. She buzzed the intercom and looked straight into the camera. "Mom, please," she said. "I have nowhere to go. Just let me stay for a little while." I watched from upstairs. She stood there with her hands clasped like a child praying for forgiveness. She didn't fully understand. I stepped out onto the balcony. She looked up, and I saw a flicker of hope cross her face. I didn't speak right away. For a moment, I thought of Paul, of the nights we sat on our old porch, sipping tea, watching the stars blink into view. He would have wanted me to be kind, but kindness without boundaries isn't kindness. It's surrender, and I was done surrendering. I said only one thing: "You don't get to hurt people, and then ask for shelter from the storm you made." Then I walked back inside and pulled the curtain closed. Not out of anger, but healing sometimes means closing the door and locking it behind you. For the first time in years, I wasn't shutting her out. I was keeping myself in. My new apartment is on the 12th floor, just high enough to see the tops of trees and the soft glow of the city at night. It's not fancy, but it's mine. The windows let in the morning sun, and the balcony is just big enough for 3 pots of mint, which I water every day. Paul used to love the smell. I crush a leaf between my fingers sometimes, just to remember how peace feels. The quiet here is different. It isn't the kind that comes from being ignored or excluded. It's the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket. I drink my tea without watching the clock. I keep the television on low because I like it that way, not because I've been told to. I folded a fresh set of towels this morning and realized I wasn't waiting for anyone to comment. That silence was mine. Not something forced on me, but something I chose. The phone still rings. Some days more than others. Megan has called 32 times. She's left 2 voicemails. I haven't listened to either. Not out of cruelty, but because I already know what they say. Sorry never sounds the same when it's said too late. She will learn that in her own time. If you've ever been made to feel like you take up too much space in a house you helped build, if someone you loved turned your presence into a problem, if you stayed silent thinking that silence would keep the peace, then hear me now. You are not clutter. You are not a burden. You are not invisible. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the most powerful thing you have left. When they stop listening to your words, your absence becomes the loudest sound in the room. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standards, and I left. Not because I gave up, but because I finally remembered what I was worth. I sit here now with the city below and the mint leaves brushing against my window. I don't need anyone's permission to belong. I belong to myself. And if you've forgotten how that feels, maybe it's time you remembered too.